All right. Once again, just an empty folder here, got some notes. So today what we're going to be doing is I'm going to show you how to build the simplest possible Django server. So the reason why I'm trying to do this, show you the simplest possible Django server, is that I think that while there are a lot of really good tutorials out there for Django, in fact, like the official tutorial is really nice. In my opinion, it's very good if you're already an experienced developer. So like I appreciate the official Django tutorial because it explains things in language I'm already familiar with in a really concise way. So I can read through it in like an hour or something and say, now I know Django by applying my knowledge from other web server frameworks to this new ecosystem. But if you don't have that prior background working with web servers, it seems to me like it would be really hard to get through the Django, quick start tutorial all in one sitting without having to look up tons of other things that you don't know along the way. So given that at this point, none of us really know anything about managing Python packages for developer projects, we don't really know much about how web servers work in general. Like we haven't actually built one. We've just been using them from the front end, consuming APIs, but we haven't actually built a backend yet. So given all that, I'm going to try to make this lecture as simple as possible, just show you the bare minimum that we need to build a server that can receive requests and send responses. So let's see, to reiterate, we're going to learn virtual environments in Python. You might have heard about these before. We're going to explain what the problem is, why you need them, and what these do, how they solve it. Learn about managing packages with Pip. So up until now, we've just been relying on the built-in modules in Python, like math, random, RE, just modules that come built into Python. We're going to install some of our own with Pip. I'm going to show you a few tricks about how to manage those for practical projects. We're going to create a new Django project. I'm going to do that using the Django command line interface. We're going to see that in just a few minutes. It's going to help us skip a few steps, automate a lot of processes, and give us some boilerplate to start out with. And then lastly, we're actually going to create some simple route handlers. So a route just being any URL that your web server is prepared to receive requests at. And then the handler is just some function that defines what happens when you receive a request to that route. They're kind of like event handlers on the front end. We'll get to that more. But then more specifically, we want to understand how our servers can receive data from clients. There's a few different ways. Method type, query string, URL params, headers, request body. And then we also want to understand on the flip side, how servers send data back to clients. There are a few different ways that you can send data, either in the response body, headers, or a status code. So this is the long and short of what we're going to be learning today. And honestly, this doesn't have a whole lot to do with Django in particular. It's going to be more just about managing Python projects in general. You can apply this to Django or Flask or even some data science projects. And then also learning generally about how web servers work, which again is not specific to Django. This is just how the web works. Any web framework is going to have these same concepts that I've described here, but I'm going to teach them to you through Django because that's the web server that we want you all to get good at throughout this course. Okay, so before we can do anything, before we can start our project, we're going to need to set up a virtual environment. But before I just dive in and start explaining what this is, why we use them, does anyone have any questions just about what we're doing today, this basic outline, or do we just want to see some technical stuff? No questions? All right, let's dive on in. So first, I want to explain a little bit about Python itself, how it exists on your system, and how that creates some problems for us as developers. So remember, when you installed Python on your machine, it had to be installed to a specific location. So if I forgot exactly where I put mine, I can use this command, type Python 3, and it tells me where the program is on my computer that lets me just type Python 3. So when I just type Python 3, like, what is this referring to? And my computer is telling me it's this program at /user/local/bin/python 3. Great. So that's where Python is installed on my machine. Now, also, when Python was installed, it also has a directory, a folder nearby that has all of the modules that I have installed for this version of Python. So Python is here at user local. If I just ls/user local and then lib, this is going to have kind of associated libraries, but not the main Python binary. And look for Python. So these are all of the modules that I have installed with Python. There's not too much here because I don't really install modules globally, but one thing you'll notice here is pip. So at the start of the course, we all installed pip as our first Python module because we're going to use that to install other Python modules. But there's a problem with just installing modules with pip, kind of the default standard way, which is that all of the modules I install with Python, with this Python 3.9, will go to this same folder of site packages. So if I'm working on multiple different projects that use different versions of the same module, that's going to be a problem for me. So the most immediate obvious example here is I'm working on a Django project today. It's going to use some particular version of Django. Maybe next week, a new version of Django is released, and I don't want to just update all my old projects immediately. But if I start a new project, I'm going to start using the new version of Django. So I need some way to install multiple versions of Django on my machine without Python getting confused about which one I'm referring to. So what I need to do is find a way to separate my modules by project, have a version of Django and other associated modules only for a particular folder, only for a particular project. So that way, if I'm collaborating with other people, I can pull down their project and install whatever version of Django that needs, and it's not going to conflict with other things that I have on my system already. So a virtual environment is what lets us achieve that. Kind of like as a metaphor for how a virtual environment works is you can sort of think of it as like a placemat at a dinner table. Like imagine if there's like a really messy baby eating at the table, they're just going to be knocking their food all over the place, probably going to make a mess on the table and stain it. So you give them a placemat, which kind of contains all their food, right in front of them. Maybe they still kind of make a mess, but at least it's their own contained mess and it doesn't get onto anyone else's placemat at the dinner table. And then also, if you want to clean up afterwards, you can just throw out the entire placemat instead of having to clean up the table manually because your entire environment is disposable. So virtual environment is going to do something similar for us. give us a new space where we can install Python, install a fresh set of modules, and then even delete it afterwards if we don't care about it anymore without affecting our main Python installation on our machine. And then one other little trick I need to show you about our current main Python installation. I was saying that our computer knows when I type Python 3 that it's actually supposed to refer to type this path here, user local bin Python 3. I could just type that out if I wanted to. And that opens the Python interpreter just the same. It's the exact same program. This is just a much less convenient way to access it. So the way I'm able to access it conveniently by just typing Python 3 is with this variable in my system called path. So if I look at it here, path is just a list of folders on your computer where your command line will check when you just type commands. So if I just type Python 3, like this isn't a file in my current folder, ls, there's nothing in here called Python 3. So then in order to understand what I'm talking about, my computer is going to look through my path and see if Python 3 exists in any of these locations. It's just, it looks like 5 separate folders, separated by colons. And so this time we got lucky. Python is actually in the first place that it looks. Because remember when I did type Python, it says it's in user local bin. And my path, the first location is user local bin. So that's how my computer is able to find Python when I type it at the command line. Okay, so now remember that. We're gonna mix things up a little bit. So to create a virtual environment, this is gonna create another installation of Python. I've already installed Python once. I'm just gonna install Python again. The way that we do that is with a built-in Python module, actually, called venv. This stands for virtual environment. So again, I'm using the -m because we're invoking this module at the command line. I'm not using it from a script. To use Python modules at the command line, we use the -m flag. And then after that, I have to add a name or the folder where I'm going to put my virtual environment. So your virtual environments, when you create them, they're contained in a folder. So we have to choose where we want to put it. There's a few different conventions for how people name and store their virtual environments. One option that you'll see sometimes, it's pretty simple, is just to store your virtual environment in the project folder itself. I don't like that for a couple of reasons. So I'm going to show you a slightly different workflow. I've created a folder just for my virtual environments that's separate from my project folder, and I'm going to create it there. So let me just show you what that folder looks like real quick. So tilde is my home folder. And then inside of that, I just create a folder called venvs for my virtual environments. You can see I've got a handful here already for other projects I've been doing in the past. But I'm going to make another one today. So let's try python-m venv, and then a file path to where I want to create this new virtual environment. Say tilde/.venvs/ and then a name for this app. I'm going to call it simplest Django server. Okay, so I was thinking for a second, but we don't get any output. So it looks like it succeeded, because if there was an error, we would see an error, but there's no output, so it looked like that succeeded. So now before we actually just jump in and activate it, I want you to understand what this actually did. So I'm going to take a look at it real quick. If I just cd into that folder, There's a couple of folders inside of it. So we go in the bin folder. These are just other copies of Python. So just like I installed Python before, this is basically a copy of that Python installation. It's just in this other folder. If we look at wait. Okay, so the one file we're actually going to read here, going to look at this a little bit more in depth. Inside of the bin folder, there's this script called activate. This is what you're going to run in order to actually enable your virtual environment and switch versions of Python. Why don't we just look at it VS Code real quick. I don't expect you to understand this fully, but I want you to get a kind of general gist of what it's doing. So this is activate. This is a shell script, runs in Bash. So the first thing I want you to notice is that it's changing your path here. So that variable I showed you before that tells your computer where Python is located, this script changes your path based on where it was previously. And then also, it defines this function called deactivate, which basically just does the opposite of what it does when you activate it. So I don't need you to look at this too in depth, but you can kind of see that there's some similar stuff going on here in the deactivate function. It's looking at your old virtual path, old virtual Python home. In the regular version, it's setting those variables. So I don't want you to think this is magic. It's just like one page of code that changes your path so that when you type Python, it'll refer to a different program than what it did before. So I'm going to activate this now so you can actually see how this works. Okay, so we need to activate our virtual environment. So the command we use for that, we're going to start with source, and then just the path to that activate script. So remember, I showed you where it was just a second ago. You do have to remember this path. This is a command that you're going to have to type every time that you start working on a Python project to activate your virtual environment. So a couple things happen. For one thing, after I source that script, which basically just runs it in my current shell, so it applies all those changes to the path variable, the first thing you should notice is that it changes my prompt. Before, when I hit enter, there would just be a blank line in between every line. Now, when I hit enter, it tells me the name of my virtual environment. So this is really important, I think, because as you're working on lots of different projects, you'll be switching back and forth between virtual environments in Django, or just virtual environments in Python in general. And it's really easy to forget which virtual environment you're using and maybe accidentally install a module into the wrong virtual environment. So I think it's really good to have unique names for all of your virtual environments. So that way, as you're working, you can see which project you're working on in your terminal, and you'll know you're installing things to the right project. So like I was saying, though, activating that virtual environment changes how our command line works so that now when we type Python, it refers to something different. So let me show you now. I do type Python 3. Now it gives me a different answer. It's telling me that Python 3 is located in this virtual environment folder inside of my home folder. It's the virtual environment that I just created, has its own installation of Python. And so now my command line knows that when I'm trying to figure out which version of Python I'm using, it's using the version in the virtual environment. So this is one way that you can kind of debug your environment. If a program isn't running how you think it should be, and you're not even sure if you're using the right version of Python, you can just check like this, like what version is actually being used when I type Python? Is this actually coming from my virtual environment? And then similarly, I showed you the path variable before, which is just a list of folders that your computer will check in order to find modules or find programs at the command line. So also, this variable has been adjusted automatically for me by the virtual environment, because you can see now there's this new folder that's been added to the front of it, which is just my virtual environment. So that's now another location that my command line will check for programs when I just type any random name into the command line. Now, when I'm done working on this project, I just have to run that deactivate function that I showed you. So it's just defined as a plain bash function in that activation script. So I can run it just by typing its name simply like this. And then immediately you can see that we no longer have the changed shell prompt. It doesn't say simplest Django server. It just has the blank line. I have my regular path. And Python 3 is in its regular location again. So that's how I enable and disable a virtual environment. So now I'm going to enable the virtual environment again, and then we're going to install Django into that virtual environment. Before I install Django, does anybody have any questions real quick about file paths, Python installations, virtual environments, stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm pretty lost right now. I'm not gonna lie. I'm hoping it'll all come together at the end, but it might be just because I'm using Windows. I'm trying to like follow along with you and go to the same paths. And so I'm just getting different stuff on my side.
Okay, using Windows is certainly going to make this demo harder to follow. I apologize for that. If you want, we could perhaps look at this offline and see what these commands look like on your system, and I could help all you Windows folks understand things a little bit better.
Just a note from Porphy, I have a response and go back questions on some of the Windows specific stuff.
Okay. So yeah, maybe you Windows folks want to get in a breakout room after class and see if you can help solve each other's problems. And if not, I'll do what I can to help you out. But yeah, unfortunately, this is going to be a more Mac focused lecture as we're talking about some of the specifics of the command line. Andrew?
Wow.
Does it matter what version of Python we have? Because I have 3.8, not 3.9.
Difference between 3.8, 3.9 shouldn't matter. As long as you've got something newer than like 3.4, it's probably fine.
Okay, I was just making sure it wouldn't like cause any issues down the line.
I don't think so.
Are the steps that we need to be able to follow, are they on the curriculum notes?
Yeah, they'll be broken down much more like step by step. This is what you do every time. I want to give you more of a theoretical background for like debugging and just your own understanding. But yeah, the actual commands that you need to write every time will be presented much more clearly. So far, this is the only actual command that you need to remember verbatim, is this source command to activate your virtual environment. All right, any other questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to check for people who aren't very familiar with this, would you recommend that we try to follow along and do it on our machines, or should we just listen and then try to follow the directions later?
I would say just listen. If you're not super confident in your command line skills, it's very likely that you're going to get stuck on something kind of uninteresting. And like it would take a while probably for us to debug everyone's individual issues. So I want you to just see it working correctly. see the paths I'm trying to show you. And maybe afterwards I can help people debug their individual systems. But yeah, so I think listening and asking questions would do you better. Were there other questions?
Yeah, so the first command that we actually need to know, you said, is that source command. Can you go over what that means, please? Again, sorry.
Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, what the activate script does is it just changes our path. So, you know, I showed us this path variable. This script is just supposed to change this path variable so that when I type Python, it gives us a different version of Python, which has a different set of modules. So you might be wondering, like, why don't we just execute it like a normal bash script? Because normally when you run a bash script, you would just do it like so normally to run a bash script, you would just run it like that. Oh, bash doesn't even like that for some reason. So this is generally how you run a bash script. You just name it and it goes. But the issue with that is normally when you run a script, it doesn't actually run it in your current terminal, but it creates like a new terminal to run it in. So, you know, like in your terminal, you can have multiple windows for it. So it's basically like when I run this script, it's like it opens up a second window and then runs all the commands here, which changes your path. But all those like path changing commands, that's temporary and it only works for your current terminal window that you're in. So running the command normally wouldn't work because it wouldn't actually set up the path in our current terminal. It would set it up in a new temporary terminal that would disappear as soon as the script finishes. So what source does is it runs a script in your current terminal window. So all those commands that update your path, it updates our current path in this terminal instead of doing it somewhere else where we're not looking. So that gets like a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of how the shell works, but I think you should be able to understand it, or at least maybe you can play around with it a little bit this afternoon. It would make sense eventually. Long story short, source is how we're going to run this script. I hope that didn't confuse you more.
No, that helps. What is the dot? Sorry, I'm sure you covered this, but what's after source, like the dot bins?
Mm-hmm. So you know what the tilde is, right?
No.
Okay, so let's start there. So tilde is just an alias for your home folder. So if I cd tilde and pwd, takes me to users Rafael Sirota. So on a Linux or Mac system, tilde is the folder with your name on it. So this is really useful because it lets you write scripts that'll work on multiple different computers without actually changing the folder names. Because like on this computer, my home folder is Rafael Sirota. On another computer, it might be R Sirota. And on your computers, your home folder has an entirely different name. So using cd tilde, you can refer to the home folder, whatever its name is on different systems. So I could have also written that like /users/ Rafael Sirota / etc. So those are exactly the same path. Just kind of a shortcut to use the tilde. Then after that, .venv is just a folder that I created. There's nothing special. There's nothing very special about the period. As a convention, that means the folder is hidden. So it doesn't normally show up when I type ls. It doesn't normally show up when you look for it in the Finder. But in a lot of ways, as far as the command line is concerned, it's really just another folder on my machine. I just didn't want to be looking at it all the time when I was like looking at my home folder. So I put a dot in front of it so it would be hidden by default. But for the most part, it's just a folder inside of my home folder. And then it's got another folder inside of it for the virtual environments. Does that help?
Yes, a lot. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Yeah, just to be clear, I'm definitely trying to leave a lot of time for questions in this lecture because I expect that there's a lot of kind of nitty gritty stuff you're seeing for the first time here. And it's the kind of stuff that can be very frustrating if you get stuck on it later, if there are bugs related to these things. So I want to help you understand your systems.
I have a question, Rafael. So are you building all of your virtual environments in like one particular folder?
Right. I have one folder that has subfolders for each of my virtual environments. That's how I'm choosing to organize it.
Okay, so you have one folder with all folders. So like you have one folder with I think that's VEMs, right?
Yep.
And then inside of that folder, you have like different folders with different virtual environments.
Yeah. So if I cd tilde, do ls-a, I've got my bash profile, the Mac trash is here, but also, where did I just put it? .vens. So this is just another folder inside of tilde, inside of my home folder.
Okay.
Inside of here, I've created a bunch of other folders. These are all virtual environments.
Okay.
By ls any of them, they're going to have basically the same contents because they're all basically the same thing, just virtual environments.
If they're all the same thing, pretty much, why don't you just have all of like the bin include lib? Why don't you just have that in the .vens folder?
Well, so
Like
let me
just
clarify
one
then.
folder with a virtual environment.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Like, why not just have like one virtual environment in .vens? Why do you make separate folders for different ones?
Because the point of the virtual environments, why we're doing this, is so that we can have multiple projects, each with their own set of dependencies. So
Okay.
each virtual environment represents one set of dependencies. So like maybe, Django queries here is using Django version 2.2, and then other modules at various versions. Django REST, I started this project a week later, maybe there's an update, it's using Django version 2.3. I want to keep those Django versions separate, so each one has their own set of modules.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. Kat, question?
Yeah, so if you're keeping them all in a separate folder like this, and that is the only way that your project knows which virtual environment to go with is when you activate it, or is there another thing that's connecting them?
Correct. That is the only reason your project knows which virtual environment you're using, is because when you activate it, it changes your path so that you're using a different version of Python that has a different set of modules.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you got it. Any other questions?
So is that you deciding to put all your virtual environments in a separate folder together? Is that completely like personal preference, or is there a best practice for industry?
That's a good question. So this is an organizational choice I made. I honestly just Googled around for how people organize their virtual environments, and this was a fairly highly upvoted answer on Stack Overflow. Some guy being like, I do it this way. And I said, yeah, that seems good enough. I'll try it too. And it's been working pretty well for me, but for sure there are other styles of managing virtual environments. So, some people don't like having this entire separate folder of virtual environments. And so they'll stick their virtual environments in their individual project folders instead. I think that has some trade-offs. It's better in some ways, more convenient in some ways, but I kind of prefer this, but I won't say that you're doing it wrong if you have a different way of organizing your virtual environments. Sound good?
Yep, thank you.
All right. Do we have any other questions? We want to see me actually install Django. All right, let's install stuff. so I'm now going to use pip to install Django. A simple command. Given that I'm already in my virtual environment, I'm visually confirming here. I will install Django. Takes a minute as I'm downloading things off the internet. Gives me a warning. Looks like I can update, but I'm not too concerned about that right now. But yeah, so this looks like it was successful. I've installed Django. So now that I've installed Django with pip, I've got another module installed that I can use. So I'm going to invoke this at the command line actually, and we're going to see what this does for us. Clear the screen real quick. Okay, so running python-m Django, just invoking the Django module at the command line, not even using it in any of my scripts yet. It gives me this list of commands here, just kind of a menu of options, how I can control or create a Django project. And it also gives me this little warning at the bottom, but we're going to fix that in just a minute, so I wouldn't worry about that. It's telling us that Django settings is not declared. It needs to know about our settings for this module, but it has no idea about those. So we're going to fix that in just a second. But first, I need to use Django at the command line here to create my project. I'm actually going to go outside of that folder. But note that even though I'm outside of the folder, I'm still in my virtual environment, because there is not actually like a one-to-one mapping, one-to-one relationship between project folders and virtual environments. I'm trying to manually set it up that way, but like I can leave the folder and still be in my virtual environment. So, all right, looking back at this list of options, there's a few things that look useful. Most of these, honestly, we'll be ignoring throughout the curriculum here. We're not going to touch most of these options. But today, what we need is start project, because we are going to start a Django project. So we'll say python-m Django start project. Yeah, let's just see what that does. Okay, so it doesn't work, gives me an error, and then it gives me a little help text, because clearly I don't know how to use this, so it's telling me how to use it. Looks like I was missing a name. Yeah, so there's a required argument. My Django project needs a name. So let's imagine that I'm building an application for a school. You know, it's going to keep track of students and staff and all that fun stuff. So I'm going to call my project school. Okay, so now when I ls in my folder, you'll see that there is a new folder that was added into my demos folder here. This folder called school that has the name of my project. Kat, question?
Yeah, so schools is a new project. It's not connected to simplest Django server. Or is it still connected to that?
Yes, it is connected to simplest Django server because we're using that virtual environment. So as I installed the version of Django that I wanted to use for the school app, that version of Django is stored in my simplest Django server virtual environment. So yeah, these are still connected.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew?
I have a question about the virtual environment. Are we in an instance of our computer right now? So if you started deleting just a bunch of random files and then you deactivated the virtual thing, would all the files reappear?
No, they would not. So
Okay,
that's a very good question.
it's
The
good because
virtual
I was gonna
environment
do it.
so this is not like a virtual machine where you can just create like an entire virtual, like Linux computer inside of your computer. It's not even like a Docker container where you have like a part of a whole machine inside your machine. All that you've copied with the virtual environment is your installation of Python and its associated modules. Yeah, definitely good question. Don't get too confident with this and start deleting your machine. All right, so let's CD into school, see what we've got here, see what I've created. I'm gonna open this in VS Code just so you can see the file structure a little more easily. Okay, so first thing I want to point out to you, actually, before we even go into the project folder itself, is there's actually a script outside of our project folder called manage.py. So again, you don't need to know too much in depth about what this is doing, but one thing that I want to point out is that it's checking for Django settings module. So you might have noticed that we got an error about that before. So this manage.py is basically just going to replace the python-m Django command that I used before. Oops, sorry. Okay, so I'm inside of my school. If I do python-m Django, this is, I need to reactivate my virtual environment. Every time you open a new terminal tab, you don't have any virtual environments activated. So you have to activate them. Because I don't actually have Django installed globally. So that's why it says there's no module Django. It doesn't know about Django until I activate a virtual environment that has it. So showing you now, we get this menu of options, starting with check, compile messages, create cache table, ending with start app, start project, test server. Great. So if I try running this manage.py file, you might notice it does pretty much the exact same thing. There's a few other options, but it's mostly the same. Check, compile messages, create cache table, ending with start app, start project, test server. So people will often ask, like, what's the difference between these two commands? Because there's like 2 or 3 different ways that you can manage Django at the command line, and people always wonder, like, what's the difference? So the answer is that there's almost no difference. But going forward, we're going to prefer to manage Django using Python manage.py, because this is going to automatically include some of our settings that are specific to this Django project. So that's actually like looking in the settings that are actually set in here, so the CLI can be even smarter. So going forward, we're going to use manage.py instead of python-m Django. We only invoked Django like this once because this is how we created the manage.py file. But going forward, that's going to be a more precise, better way to manage our Django application. Okay, and now that I've created a folder where I'm going to hold my actual project code, there's one more really important thing that I need to do before I start actually showing you any application code, before we actually get into the folder structure for Django, and that is dependency management. So like I was saying before, the virtual environment is not included in this folder itself. It's not part of the repository. So that's good in a lot of ways because it makes our repo smaller. We don't have to bundle a version of Python with it in our GitHub repository. That's just kind of wasteful. Everyone has Python on their own machine or they can install it themselves. But it makes it a little bit harder to share this project with other developers because if we push this up to GitHub and they clone it down to GitHub, they need to get the right version of Django to work on our project. So the way that we do that is we're going to have to record all of our dependencies in a text file using a tool called Pip Freeze. So let me show you this. We're going to use pip, which is all about managing our dependencies. And then if I use the subcommand Pip Freeze, it prints out this list of all of the modules that are being used in my application. So I'm not sure what the first and the last ones are. Those might be dependencies that Django depends on. So I installed Django, it installed other things. But at the very least, Django is here, which I installed manually. You saw me type pip install Django. That's how it got added to our project here. And then Pip Freeze tells me just, a list of everything I've installed so far and which version of that module I've installed. So what I want to do now is save this to a file. I'm going to do that with Pip Freeze. And then this angle bracket means write the output of this command to a file. Use requirements.txt. I could choose any name for this file if I wanted to, but requirements.txt is a very conventional name for the required modules for a project to work. So now, if I ls in that same folder, we can see I've added another file, requirements.txt. Which if I just read that, it just has those same 3 lines that we saw as output before from Pip Freeze, only now they're stored into a file.
Would this be kind of like a package as JSON kind of thing for like a JavaScript project? You're just kind of having a file that has all the requirements in it before you can load it kind of thing?
Yes, that is exactly the idea. Everything we're trying to achieve here with Python using virtual environments and pip and requirements.txt, we're trying to basically recreate how package management works in Node, where you can have project-based dependencies with your package.json, which are separate from your global modules, separate from your other packages. Yeah, we're just trying to do that same thing in Python. So unfortunately, historically, this has always been a weak point of Python, in my opinion. Package management in Node, I think, has always been much more elegant just because it's a newer language. I think they had, more of an opportunity to learn from the past and do it right. Whereas Python kind of started off weird where everything is global. And so like Python just never had this concept of local or project specific modules, just everything is global. And so they had to use virtual environments as like a simple way to have project-based modules, but they're still kind of technically globally installed, like working with how Python already worked without redesigning the entire language. So, virtual environments are the best solution that the community could come up with without entirely rewriting Python, but they are still a bit clumsy and awkward, I think, compared to the same problem being solved in Node. And in fact, like in Python, the way that we manage virtual environments actually changes pretty often over the years. This module that I'm showing you now, Venv, I think is only a couple of years old. There have been a variety of other modules people used to use in the past, like virtual env, env, lots of very similarly named modules that are really hard to talk about because they're just different ways to abbreviate virtual environment. So for a lot of reasons, managing packages in Python can be kind of a headache, harder than it is in Node, but I'm hoping that this makes it as simple as possible. I'm sure that was more than you were asking for, but I hope that helps.
No, it's perfect. I appreciate it.
Great. Kat, did you have another question?
Yeah, do you do this every time you install a new dependency, or does it update automatically once you do it one time?
Pip Freeze does not update automatically. I know that that's the default behavior in Node. Actually, let me just Google this real quick. Oh, wow. That kind of surprises me. Yeah, and this is from 2021. Wow. So that was a really good question, Kat, by the way, because in Node, when we add packages to our project, they automatically get added to the package JSON. So we don't have to manually manage our packages quite as much. And it's definitely a very good question to be asking yourself when you're solving the same problem in a different language. I already know how to solve this problem in one language. How do I do that same thing in this other context? Try to, Google for how to do the thing that you want to do. And so I'm really kind of surprised to see that that's actually not possible, because this is something I would assume that a lot of people would want to do. So yeah, to answer your question, every time you add a new module, a new dependency to a Python project, you should regenerate your requirements.txt. So you just run this command again. It's going to override whatever was in that file originally and replace it with your new current list of dependencies. And then you want to make sure you add and commit and push that to GitHub so that when other people clone down your project, they will also get your latest version of the dependencies. So yeah, that's definitely the kind of thing you should be wondering about. And I apologize that there isn't a more automatic way to manage your dependencies. But on the plus side, in Python, you're probably not going to be installing quite as many dependencies. So it's not going to be such a huge manual effort. Whereas in Node, like you're installing packages all the time for like every little thing. So it is definitely greatly appreciated in Node that your packages update automatically. All right, does anyone have any other questions about package management, Pip Freeze? Oh, actually, let me just show you one last thing here. So Pip Freeze, this is how you record your requirements. On the other side, if you want to install from a requirements file, you use this syntax. So pip install -r says that we're not naming a public pip module, but we're going to use a file. And then we're just going to install all the modules that are listed in that file. And then we just pass in the location of the requirements.txt file that we created from Pip Freeze. Andrew?
For the pip install requirements, is it important to only do this in a virtual environment? Because would it still install if you're not in a virtual environment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Very good question. So like I showed you before how I did not have Django installed globally because I only use it for specific projects. If I ran pip install -r requirements.txt without being in a virtual environment, my expectation is that it would install all those modules which were intended for that one project to my global Python installation, which is definitely not what I want. So I would feel really embarrassed and have to spend a few minutes or an hour or whatever, I don't know how long it would take me, figuring out what exactly I installed on my system and uninstalling all those modules, making sure there were no other side effects or whatever, getting my system back to how it was before. So that would definitely be a mistake. So that was why I was stressing before, make sure you know what virtual environment you're in before you run any pip commands or do anything with Django. Right, any other questions about package management? All right, so I think we are long overdue for a break. When we come back, I'm going to actually explore the contents of this folder here, tell you a little bit about what it's for. We're going to write some code, see some data moving around the internet. So one last chance for questions before we take a break. Anybody?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I want to ask one more thing that I'm still kind of confused about.
Sure.
I'm just wondering, so I know you did the simplest Django server folder, and then that's the folder that the virtual, I mean, I know that your virtual environment is in a separate folder, but that's tied to the virtual environment, and now school is also tied to the virtual environment. But I'm wondering, is that normal to kind of have two folders like that are both working off the virtual environment? Is that kind of typical?
It's not. So for clarity here, the folder simplest Django server, at this point, this actually has nothing to do with my Django project. This is just a folder where I'm holding the notes. So the thing is that when I run Python-m Django start project, that creates a folder for me. So that created the folder called school. But I didn't want to start this demo without a folder to put the notes in. So I just created another folder for the notes file. But then I CD'd out of it because I knew that when I ran the Django command, it was going to create yet another folder, and I didn't want it to be like nested in a weird way.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, great question. Just for clarity, this simplest Django server folder is not really part of the project, the Python project we're doing today. That's just kind of where I put the notes to start off. It's not connected to the virtual environment in any way. Just the school is, because it's using a version of Django that we have installed in our virtual environment. All right, any other questions? I know that this is not intuitive stuff, but I think it's really good to understand it well. So please keep them coming. All right, no more questions for right now. Okay, so it's 10:24. Let's come back at 10:35, and I'm going to show you how to actually run this server and write some routes. All right, class, welcome back. So now it's the moment you've been waiting for. We're actually going to write some code, move some data around the internet. It's going to be tons of fun, trust me. So looking at our folder structure again here real quick. Remember, I'm in a folder called school. That was the name of my project, school. But I want to point out, you're not seeing double here. Inside of the folder called school, there is another folder called school. So inside of your main Django project, there will be some number of modules. And by default, you start out with one main module that has the same name as the project. So this is going to have kind of some general settings for my project as a whole. But later on this week, as we get more organized with our Django projects, we're going to be creating more modules to organize our project further. But today, this is just your simplest possible look at Django. We're not going to be dealing with organization of large projects. So I'm going to be doing everything in this main module here. I just wanted to explain this naming folder structure. It might look kind of weird if it's the first time you see it. So let me just write that down. We create a project called school. It's a folder called school, which contains all the modules of our project. By default, there's only one module. I like to think of this as kind of like the main or the primary module, or like your global settings module, sort of. So the main module has the same name as your project. I know that can be a little confusing when you see it for the first time, but the way I think of this is I have a school project, which has a school module inside of it, or a school app inside of it. So if we look back real quick at all right, so if we look at this menu for Django manage.py, how we can manage our app, there's two different things we can start, apps and projects. So I think this terminology is a little strange, but generally a project is like the bigger sort of organization. That's going to be your entire GitHub repo, most likely, is a Django project. And then apps are smaller pieces of the project. So maybe you have some organizational reason to group some set of routes together, and they'd be different from another set of routes. That would be an app. So I think this is kind of weird because colloquially, I think of an app as being like an entire project, or like, you know, something you install on your phone or whatever. But in Django, apps are smaller organizational units. So I sometimes call them modules because that implies to me more what they actually do, is that it's a smaller organizational unit. But so then inside of this folder for our main module, there is a handful of different files that are used for setting up your Django project. This settings.py file is pretty important for, you know, configuring settings, changing options for how your server works. But honestly, we're not even going to get into this today. We're going to start cracking this open tomorrow, and you're going to understand what some of these specific settings do. And then as we get better at Django throughout the weeks, you'll learn about more of these settings. But today, we are just going to be working in this one file, urls.py, where we can write URLs. So it looks like there's already something there. So before I even write my own URLs, I'm going to try to see what this server does already, just by default. So just a second ago, I ran this manage.py here, looking for some commands that I can use. And this last one here on the bottom, this is what I'm looking for right now, run server. This is going to start a development server that I can use for testing my Django application locally. So it's important to note that the server that comes built in with Django is very convenient for local development. For example, it'll restart automatically if any of your Python files change. So you don't have to like manually restart your server every time you change something on the back end. But unfortunately, it's not actually like secure or robust enough for us to use on the public internet. So when we actually get to deployment later, we're going to have to figure out a different solution for running our server. But for right now in development, this is what we'll be using. I'm going to Python manage.py run server. It's giving me a warning about migrations, but we're not going to worry about that until we have our database set up. But for now, though, it's telling me that the app is running at localhost 8000. So this is a slightly different format, but 127.0.0.1, that's another way for your computer to refer to itself. So that's localhost effectively. So I go to localhost 8000. So we get this kind of default generic Django welcome message. So because I've got debug mode on, it's trying to be helpful and tell me that Django is installed correctly, but I haven't defined any URLs. It looks like there is actually one thing defined here. It says admin. I don't know what that is, but I'm going to try typing it in my browser, see what happens. So it looks like there's some other page that's already set up. So it's premature to dive too much deeper into this, but I just want to show you that Django does come with a whole lot of functionality included. When we have the database set up, we can use this Django admin panel to get a convenient graphical interface for modifying our data. I don't honestly use that very often. I would rather use the command line or scripts for modifying my data, but I just want to show you that there is some front end already built in. Let's not worry about that. So looks like there's some kind of a pattern here already. We've got this admin path, thinking I can just kind of extend this list here and then add some of my own routes. So any website needs to have a home page. Currently, it's just using the default Django homepage. I'm going to replace that with my own. I'm going to declare a path. And then the first argument to this path function is the URL that you want to handle. So because this is for the root of our application, I'm just going to pass in an empty string. So if someone goes to localhost 8000 with nothing else after it, this is what should handle that. And then I need a function that will handle this route. So I'm going to just name it here, and then I'll define it in just a second. I'm just going to try to return something here real quick, see if this does anything. Nope. Okay. So the simplest way that you can think about a route handler for any web server, not just Django, is that a route handler is really like an event handler on the front end. So imagine before we were handling click events, and there are different kinds of events like click or key press. And then when the event triggers, we get to call a function which we've declared beforehand. And that function gets passed an event object, which tells us more about that click or about that key press. So similarly, when we're handling routes to our server, we're going to write route handlers. These are event handler functions, basically, that can handle different types of requests, like a GET request or a POST request. And then they receive the request object that tells about the request. So just like when you're handling a click event, you get that event object that tells you what was clicked on, other information like was it a left click or a right click. So here we get this request object coming into our function that tells us a little bit about the function, or that tells us a little bit about the request. So if you don't really know what to expect from a web server yet, let's just take a look at this and see what's on it. So the request is a dictionary. Calling dir like this is going to show me all the keys. So I'm going to see if there are any interesting or useful looking keys on there. Just refresh the page. Okay, so this whole object here is all of the information that is attached to the request object. For the most part, you can ignore the things that start with underscores, because those are like intended to be private. It's not intended that you should use them. So let's just kind of ignore all these highlighted things in the middle. But there's still a lot of really useful stuff here. And some of these might seem like things you recognize. Like we can check the content type on the request, check the path. So it's like the URL that was requested. The request method tells us if it was get or post. When we get to authentication later, request.user is going to tell us who is logged in, who is sending the request. Also, where is it? Headers should be in this list somewhere. You're there. So the request headers, we can access them as well. So let's just print some of these out, see what they look like, see what kind of information we can work with on our server. All right, so I made some changes. You can see my server restarts automatically. I'm just going to clear my screen here, refresh the page. What's the problem? Okay, I think I was using incorrect syntax here. I thought that this was a dictionary, and it seems like it might actually be an object. Refresh the page one more time. Okay, so now we can actually see this information that I was trying to print out. So request.method, this tells me that I got a GET request, because anytime you just type a URL into your browser, that is a GET request. And then after that, we can see all of the headers that were attached to the request. So for example, there's some user agent information. I'm using Chromium or Google Chrome. On Mac OS, okay, here's the actual user agent string, which says like every browser listed all at once. So it's kind of confusing, but it is important information that the client has to transmit. Here's a cookie that was set for some reason. So my browser is sending these cookies up in a header. So a lot of information we can access in the headers. But my server isn't doing its job yet. It's not responding to this request. I'm able to receive the data from the front end, but as I'm sure many of you noticed, I'm getting this error every time I run my server, every time I refresh the page, I'm getting this error because this route doesn't return any data. So like I was saying last week, this is a really fundamental part of HTTP is that every request gets a single response. If you don't send a response, then the client is going to get confused and just wait forever. And that's an error. So Django, very helpfully, if your function doesn't return anything, it'll throw an error because returning in a Django route handler is how you send data to the client. All right, so now to send the response, I'm not gonna just, return 10 or whatever, just some raw data like that. You saw before that didn't work. Django's gonna make this a little bit more complicated. So there's a special function that I have to use to create HTTP responses. But then when I use this special function, it helps Django do some other things for me automatically. So it's going to automatically set some response headers to be correct, so I don't have to do that manually. So in order to send an HTTP response, we can import. So this is not built into Python, but this is included with Django. So just by installing Django, I get access to this. A function called HTTP response, which lets us create strings essentially that we can send to the client. So here we're going to say response. And then in the parentheses here, we're going to put in whatever we want to respond to the client with. So I'm just going to hard code in some HTML. So now when I refresh the page, excuse me. Oh, right.
Never return the response.
I did not return the response. It's a classic mistake. I can't believe I've done that again. So yes, I have declared a response. Django knows what the response is supposed to be. The client does not know what the response is supposed to be. So we have to return the response. So let's see what that looks like. Shouldn't be surprising anyone. This is an H1 containing that text that I specified. Right here in the HTTP response. So this literal text just got sent down. The browser correctly interprets this as an H1, interprets it as HTML, and so it gets rendered to the page. But there's a lot more stuff that we can do with the response beyond just returning it. So let's actually take a look at this too and see what we can see. So whereas the request showed us, extra options about the client sending us data, this is going to show us some extra options about the response that we send back to the client. So again, we're going to refresh the page real quick. So these are all the properties on the response. Again, let's just try to ignore everything that starts with an underscore. But even then, there's a lot of useful stuff here. So some cookie control features. We can set a status code. Oh yeah, so here's headers. So yeah, on the response, we care about response headers, response status code, and the response body is also important, but we specify the body by just returning data, by just returning the response itself. It's not a property on it. So status code and headers are pretty important. If you don't set status code by default, it's going to be 200 because Django is just assuming that it did what it was supposed to do unless you tell it otherwise. But if we want, we can change this to something else. So set response dot status code. In theory, I should be, doing some if-else logic here to determine what went wrong or what actually happened, and then looking in the Wikipedia list and choosing a meaningful status code based on the situation. but this is just a pretty simple demo. So I'm just going to hard code in response.status is 418. So now if I refresh the page, that status code is being applied to the response here. So we can see my browser actually thinks that's an error because it's a 400 level response, but it does recognize it. It says I'm a teapot. In the network tab, we can see the status coming back is 418. So in the network tab, it's going to highlight it in red, tell us that that was an error probably. Yeah, but so that now is the basic request response cycle. So we are now sending a request to a web server and it is responding with HTML. It's not even responding with a complete HTML document. It's just an H1, but our browser is able to make sense of it anyway, and it renders that H1 on the screen. So this is a pretty big milestone. I think we've finally made a round trip with our server. And I'm hoping that you've been able to understand all the pieces that went into it up until this point, because it just gets more complicated from here. Does anyone have any questions real quick before I show you all another way that we can pass data around, another way that we can send data to the server from our client? Anybody have any questions about what we have just discussed? Andrew?
Just to clarify, I'm a little confused about the big picture behind it. So Django just is like for handling all like the requests that would go into like our future websites.
At its core, that's its primary responsibility, is to listen on a web server, just waiting for people to send you requests. And then when someone sends a request, it analyzes the request to determine how to respond to it. You know, if it's a get versus post, then you'll use these handlers or those handlers. Depending on the specific URL that's requested, you'll use a specific handler. And then once once Django figures out which is the correct handler function, it passes the request object into that function, calls the function, returns the response to the client, and then continues again waiting for someone else to send a request. So that's the core of what Django does. But it turns out that in the process of trying to build a web server that does that, there are a lot of other problems that will arise along the way, such as managing a database or converting data between different formats or working with other third-party APIs. A lot of other problems that are related to this core problem of just sending and receiving HTTP requests and responses. So in addition to this core like server technology, Django has a bunch of other components included into it. So probably the one other component we'll spend the most time talking about is Django ORM, which is a feature of Django that makes it really easy to integrate your database. So like we're going to learn SQL, which is its own language for interacting with databases, but pretty soon we'll learn how to use Python in Django in order to interact with our database, which should be a little bit more elegant, and it should integrate better with the rest of our code, because then we're doing everything in Python as much as possible. So yeah, Django is big. It does a lot of things. It can be hard to kind of, get the big picture and be like, what is Django? Because it does so many different things. So that's why I'm trying to like narrow down the scope here and make it clear that this is what I think is Django's #1 core responsibility, is just listening for HTTP requests and then sending the appropriate HTTP response. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to make another route Just going to add another URL to my URL patterns here. Excuse me. So this is just going to be another route. So that's the URL I want to use. And we're going to make another route handler function. Again, this takes in the request object. All right, so let me just confirm that we can create another route, that this one works. Okay, so I've declared this path, another route, is being handled by this function, another route handler. And I can see this function here, it's defined, another route handler. It sends this response, welcome to another route. So that's what I'm expecting to see in my browser. Not at localhost 8000, because that's the root route, but at / another route. So we can see now that we get this different HTML page. Welcome to another route. I've created the second route on my server. I could create as many pages as I want in this style, honestly, just having a big long list. Although, as you'll see soon, today or tomorrow, actually, we're going to show you better ways to organize your routes. So in a real Django project, you wouldn't just put all your routes in one long list here in your main module, because you probably have way too many routes in a large project to put them all in one file. So more practically, this file here, urls.py in the main module, this serves as more of like a table of contents that just has like references to your other modules instead of actually having all the code right here. But that's just like an organizational thing. It doesn't actually change how the code flows. So for simplicity, I'm just doing this all in one file. Later on, you'll learn how to break things up in other files and import things where they need to be. Andrew?
Speaking of what you just said about like the organization of it, so I guess it doesn't really matter what order we have the paths in within URL patterns then, right? If we're using it as like a table of contents.
It does actually matter. So that's a good, very good question. And actually, as you'll see more towards the end of today's demo, it's possible to write URLs that are ambiguous. So here, these are all just hard-coded strings. You know, the only way anything is going to match this is if they type in exactly another dash route. But sometimes you can write patterns for your URLs. So there could be potentially multiple specific, or potentially one specific URL could match multiple patterns, could match multiple route handlers, in which case only the first one actually runs. So that's a really good point. The order you declare these route handlers is essential because they are checked from top to bottom. So if there's multiple route handlers that could match the same request, the one that's at the top takes priority. That's a very good point. You might at some point have bugs in your Django apps where the solution is just change the order of your routes. So that's definitely something that you need to be aware of. We'll see in a minute how that happens. Now let's talk about another way that we can get data into our server from the client. So I believe the other day I showed folks how to use query strings. So if you have a question mark at the end of the URL, everything after that question mark is not really part of the path, but it's extra data that you can send to the server. So let's say we do something like height equals 20. So that's great. I just declared a variable height equals 20 and I've sent it to the server, but my server is not prepared to do anything with it, doesn't look for it, so it just happily ignores it. That's fine. Now I'm gonna update my other route handler so it actually does use that query string. I'm gonna make a local variable for it. Now you might have remembered when I looked at the request object, it had this property on it called get in all capital letters. We can use this, it's a function, we can use this to access the query string parameters, sometimes called get parameters or get variables. And then we want to get them, we want to retrieve them. And then the name of the variable that I'm trying to retrieve. And then we'll put it in the string. Make an F string. Okay, so now our server is actually using the data that we passed in. So we're taking in this request object. And then the request has this built-in functionality for getting variables off of it. If we want to get the get variables, we access get. Then to retrieve them, actually, it has a method on it called get. I know this is a little bit confusing, just kind of using the same word multiple times in slightly different contexts. I might have named these differently, but this is how Django works. But still, it's going to let us get that variable from the URL, and then we can interpolate that into our response, which we send to the client. So now when I refresh the page, it's taking this variable from the query string and putting it right into our H1 here. And I could change this. Every time I reload the page, it's going to take that data fresh from that individual request and then use that to process the response. So this is just one of the ways that a route handler should be considering the data that it takes in order to process different responses. Especially when we're using a GET request, you're going to use the query string pretty commonly because GET requests cannot have bodies. When you're using a POST request or a PUT request or other types of requests, you're not going to do this as commonly because the body is probably a more convenient way to add this extra information. So let's see, let's imagine we had a second variable. So I've added a second variable here now. I refresh the page without passing anything in, so that's fine. Django tries to be flexible about it. The variable I didn't mention just gets a value of none. But if I do want to pass it in, I'll just use an ampersand. So we can separate different variables in a query string with an ampersand, height equals 40 and age equals 32. This is kind of how we form a dictionary in the URL bar. It's very convenient though that Django doesn't force us to parse this string and try to get the keys and values out of it, but it automatically creates a dictionary for us that we can extract the individual bits of information that we need. So that is very convenient that we can just use, request.get height, etc. Okay, so I've got one more thing that I want to show you today, one more way that the client can share data with the server. I'm going to show you how to use parameterized URLs. This is going to be like 99% the same as what we just did here with the query string, but it's just going to look a little bit prettier. So for reference, have people seen this before in a URL? It's like query, the question mark with the ampersand, the equals, like people have seen these in URLs before. They look kind of ugly, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, nobody likes these. So what might be a little bit more common is something like this. So here, it kind of looks like we're passing the same information in, the 40 and the 32, but we're only passing in the values, not the keys. But also, it looks a lot prettier. It's a little bit more like a conventional modern website, like it's supposed to be human readable, actually. So this next technique I'm going to show you is just a different way that you can write your URLs so that you can get your variables in like this. It doesn't really enable you to build a different type of application. It's the same thing as using a query string, just tacking extra variables into the URL, but it looks a little bit prettier. So this is an important technique to understand. Make a route. So this route's going to start with params, which should give you some clues about what it does. But then the next part of this URL is not going to be literal text. We're going to use some special syntax here. I got to define a function for it. Put that over here. Okay, so what I want to point out here now is that in our URL, we've added a variable into this second spot after the slash here. When you see colons in a URL like this, this syntax tells you that this isn't like literal text of the URL. No one's going to type it into their browser with params / angle bracket int : height angle bracket. This is a variable. So colon in a URL generally indicates a variable. So what this is saying now is I can request this URL / with params and then slash anything. And then whatever I type here for anything, that gets assigned to this variable height, which is supposed to be an integer. So I'm declaring a type for this variable. Could have been a string, could have been an integer or a float. I'm saying this is going to be an integer. And then I need to change the signature for my function so that it is expecting it. So I'm going to use a keyword argument in Python. Say, I'm going to give it a default value, but I am expecting that this is going to get overridden. Wait. Okay, so I've set a default value for this keyword argument height, but I'm expecting that this will get overridden by whatever is passed in the URL. So I'm just going to go to my params route. And first of all, that crashes. So I just typed with params without anything after it, which means that I basically left my variable empty because I have not defined a route that's just with params. I have a route that's with params with a variable. So this was technically a 404 error. So let's try this again. Params slash 23. Oh, I didn't return anything. Let's do that. One more time. There. So now this new route functions exactly the same as the old route, except that the URL is a little bit prettier. I don't have to use that query string syntax. I just use the parameterized URL here. And what you call it, Django is able to put it into the right place. It's able to make it a variable in my function. So if I want to add another one, just add another slash. Got a variable for my age. Set a default for that, and then also use it in the string. All right, so now I no longer have a route called with params with one variable. I have a route called with params with two variables. So again, this is a 404 until I pass in the correct number of variables. So now I've passed in the right amount of data to my route. And so it tells me correctly, you're 23 feet tall, 55 years old. So that's kind of what I was expecting. One thing I want to point out, though, the big difference between this and using the query string is here the order of the parameters matters, because I'm not specifying that 23 is the height and 55 is the age. It's just going based on the order. And then based on the order I define them here, height is defined as the first variable, age is defined as the second one. If I listed these in the other order, so 55 and then 23, it just switches the statement. So I'm now 55 feet tall and 23 years old. So I think this looks a little bit nicer. So when you're writing URLs that humans are going to see, you might prefer to put the extra work in and write them like this. But when you're writing URLs that humans are not going to see, so like later on as we're building REST APIs, honestly, most of your URLs humans are not going to see. In those cases, you would probably prefer the query string just because it's a little bit easier to get the data in and out of it and nobody's looking at it, so it doesn't really matter how ugly it is. And then one last thing, there was a question earlier about the ordering of the routes and when this matters. So this is a good opportunity for me to just show you real quickly how order matters. Actually, there's a few hands up. So why don't we take questions and then I'll demonstrate that to you. Ivan, I think you've been waiting for a minute.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, so when would the default values actually fill in the blanks per se for the URL? Because you know how you set this default value, but it'll break if you don't give it any value. So
Yeah.
when would it actually like just taking the 10 for height and taking the 10 for age?
So that's a really good question. I honestly have no idea. Just like, you know, the way Python syntax works is I need to supply default values for these keyword arguments. But just the way Django works is it's going to throw a network error, an HTTP error, if I don't have the right number of parameters for what I've defined here. So yeah, you're right. I have no idea, honestly, how to get this function to run with the default parameters, because if you don't specify one of them, Django is just going to crash. Sorry, I can't actually explain it very. Andrew?
Could you move your screen up a little? There's a question I wanted to ask. Yeah, so on another route handler, your requesting is almost requesting it like, it's almost like a dictionary.
Yeah.
So is that height and age inside that original another route handler? Are they ints or are they strings?
That is a very good question. So
I figure it would work either way, but you did switch it to in the second one. That's why I'm wondering.
yeah, that's a good question. Let me actually log this here before I tell you the wrong thing. Okay, so then we want to check out another route handler, just add another route. Yeah, so height is a string. So this was my assumption, but I just wanted to clarify it. I just want to confirm it before I just started talking about things. So one of the things that makes web development hard is that strings are the only data type that you can send over the wire. So in JavaScript, we have a handful of data types. In Python, we've got a whole bunch of data types. Many of them are similar, you know, like our dictionaries and our lists. Some of them are different, you know, Python objects are quite a bit different from JavaScript objects. But when we're transferring data over the internet, the only data type we have available to us is strings. Even when you're sending numbers, they're really strings as far as HTTP is concerned. So the server has to have some way of like knowing that these are numbers actually written as strings. So like JSON data is a common way that we transmit data across the internet, which is in fact a string. You know, a JSON object is really just one string, a series of characters. But because it has a specific format, your server is able to convert that into actual numbers and lists and objects and things. But so here we're just taking this raw data from the query string. Django hasn't processed this in any like super smart way. It just knows that there's all these key value pairs. But since it's just taking the raw data of, you know, what the user typed into their URL bar, they can only type strings into the URL bar. So the query string is always going to be strings. Anything that you get out of request.get.get, I would expect that these would always be strings. So as you might imagine, this is sometimes kind of inconvenient because if you know you're expecting the client to send you a number, that's just an extra step you have to do of get the string from the query string, then convert it into a number, and then do what you were trying to do. So for that reason, Django offers us this extra syntax. Instead of just declaring the variable, we can also declare the type. Because it's really common that you're expecting someone to pass numbers in the URL, and then you have to convert that string into an actual number. So Django just lets us define upfront, like this URL parameter. Once we're actually dealing with it in our Python code, we want to deal with it as an int. Like we don't even want to think about the fact that it used to be a string. Just convert it for us automatically, please. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Courtney?
Kind of going off of Ivan's question, line 39. I guess I'm just confused why we're having to set the height and the age to anything if we're not even using the values.
I mean, can you use keyword arguments in Python without setting defaults? Like if I don't have this declared, so here it's complaining about unexpected keyword argument age. So Django is trying to pass in extra keyword arguments that the function is not prepared for. And so it's crashing.
I guess, so we're setting the parameter to something, even though we know it's like we're changing the value.
Wouldn't it just work even if you don't set a value for it? Like if you just put height and age?
Yeah, I don't think we need default values. We need the parameters that were the default values should be fine without them.
Okay.
Let me try it.
Someone is telling me that this is new in Python 3. So most of my Python experience was way back when with Python 2. So let's try that. So we're saying we don't need set the defaults. We can just name them. That's what you're telling me?
Yeah, that should work.
Okay, and then if we do it without all the required parameters. Oh, but so now the issue is just that it doesn't match the URL. Because if I call it with one parameter, it's not going to think that I'm accessing this path, but with this variable missing. Now it thinks I'm trying to access this path, which doesn't actually have a route handler defined. Everyone see what that problem is? So we were right about Python syntax. We definitely don't need to supply default values for these functions. But so Django still won't call this function correctly if we have the wrong number of arguments.
That's because it doesn't have it, like you're saying, it doesn't have an actual path, that it can't handle it because it hasn't been declared yet for that path, or there's no logic to handle that path, right?
Right. So here, actually, let's try it like this. Here's something we can do. So here I've defined two paths that are going to be handled by the same route handler. So if someone goes to with params with two variables or with only one variable, we handle that with the same function. So it should now be possible to call this function without age being defined. So there it is with both params.
I was about to say, aren't you going to get a signature conflict since you don't have the same number of parameters?
Well, I think because in the function, you still define, so in the function, it still requires you put two parameters into that with params function, right?
Mhm.
It's expecting, is that it maybe? I don't know.
Yeah.
Just gonna do the first one first.
Maybe if you set one of them with the default value, and I wonder if that would work if you put the second parameter that you're passing in with the default value, if that would work.
Still telling me it is requiring age as a positional param. Yeah, because it's still the same function. And here, if we don't have a default, then age is a required parameter. See, I feel like we might actually need to have the useless defaults. I see what you're all getting at, and I appreciate, finding different ways to explore this, thinking of prettier ways that we can write our code. But it seems like there's just kind of an awkwardness with like how Django knows it's the right function and how it passes arguments into your request, that if you don't have these defined, then it's going to struggle in certain situations. I don't know. If anyone has other ideas, I'm open, but.
Could you just use like args or something? Like we can pass any number of arguments? Instead of named positional arguments, you just give it, an unpacked args parameter.
So how did that go?
Maybe not quarks, but args. I think it's like the same thing. It's just
well, these are keyword arguments specifically.
okay, the keyword arguments. Okay. Never know until you try, I guess.
Hang on, I'm forgetting this real quick. Oh my God, get out of here.
But isn't Python trying to match the function with the same number of arguments whenever you're doing your URL responses?
Right.
Yeah, I was just curious if you use quarks, if it's that way, it expects you can add as many as you want, and depending on how many you add in the URL, it just gets passed in anyway. And it won't be rendered into HTML probably, but I mean, the URL maybe also work. I don't know.
Quarks is supposed to be a dictionary, right? So, or wait, hold on. Oh no, the problems with the age key. So let's say, so now the function is running.
So Raphael, let's try something real quick on 39 instead of keywords. Put in age and height in that order and see if it reverses it.
Wait, let me get rid of the. You want to take out the quarks here, you're saying, first?
Right, basically go back to what you originally had, but instead of having height and then age, change it to age and then height and see if it actually switches it. That way you can tell if it's based off of the keyword or the position.
Well, here, these are positional parameters, so I don't think that's going to work. Generally, to get these URL parameters.
So on line 47, or sorry, on 48, where you have the int height and the int age as your positional arguments, is it doing that by position into your function or by name into your function?
So it's looking at the positions in the URL, but then these variables are getting passed in by name. So like height and age should be keyword arguments. So
when you run it now, does it swap them?
It doesn't run because we're declaring age and height as positional arguments. And it's telling here that we didn't get any positional arguments because they're getting passed in as keyword arguments.
Well, get rid of line 47 so that'll work.
So now, what did we just run here? So we're on with params with 2 positional parameters. So that does seem to have worked. though it got confused, I guess, from having this other similar route next to it.
Well, you can only have one route. Python doesn't support overloading, so you can only have one valid route per function.
Yeah, guess so. I hadn't tried it before. So yeah, it looks like, so we've rewritten our function to use positional arguments instead of keyword arguments. And it seems like data is still getting in there, just how we would expect. We should be able to flip this around and it'll flip the two values around. Cool. So I'm guessing that there's some magic behind the scenes in how Django works. All the examples I've seen online, people usually use keyword arguments for getting the parameterized URLs in, but looks like this works too. So if you like it, go for it. Courtney, did you have your hand up?
I think Jake had his up first.
All right, Jake.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand this from like a more practical standpoint. I've never had to type parameters into a URL before like that. Like, would you say, like, how does that handled normally? Like if you're on a client machine and you're trying to create a database entry, you have to fill out those fields and like hit submit, let's say, and then like however the page was like coded up, it would like insert those parameters into the URL for you. And let's say maybe you didn't have an age in in an age text box. When you hit submit, maybe whoever coded it would put a default in there at that point, like none or something like that? Or is that not how those kind of things are handled? In like attaching those to the URL, how does that happen exactly?
I think you got the right idea. For sure, no one is manually typing those parameters into the URL like you saw me. It's more that your framework is going to generate URLs that have those parameters in them. So like, let me think. If you're reading a list of blog posts, you can probably see just like the titles of them, and then you would click on each of them to go to a different page that shows you more information about that specific blog post. A lot of URL structures would have an ID number for the blog post in the URL, but you're not typing it manually. The server, when it is creating the link that you can click on from the blog preview, it is automatically putting the blog post's ID number in there so that you can basically do a for loop to render URLs, to render links for a whole bunch of different things you want to link to. And as long as the ID is different, those will all be different parameters in the URL. So you can look up a different thing in your database based on that. I feel like that was slightly clumsy explanation, but I do feel like you had the right answer. Does that help? Do you want to follow up on that?
No, that works. Thank you.
Cool. Courtney?
I was just wanting to make sure that we don't need to give the params like default values at all. Right. Line 39.
Right. I just did that because that was how I had seen code examples and it seemed to be working just fine.
Okay.
If you think that this is preferable, then go for it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? All right, I just want to, not really even going to show this, but just explain very briefly. So as we were showing before, this URL here with params and then has two variables in it. Let's say I had another route Okay, whatever. Just wanted the syntax highlighting to stop yelling at me. What is- Not sure why this is still underlined here. Oh,
It's because you have two functions with the same name.
I had a typo in it. There's an extra R. Okay. Anyways, so all I wanted to point out here is that on line 51, we've got this route with params with two variables. Right below, we've got this route that's just hard coded with params and then /foo/bar. So there's an ambiguity here because if I go to /with params /foo/bar, like that will get confused with this first URL because this could kind of look like with params and then one variable and then another variable. So the fact that I have this dynamic route on top of my hard-coded route means that the hard-coded route on line 52 is actually inaccessible. So that was that problem that I briefly mentioned before. You can encounter bugs like this just based on the ordering of your routes. So that's in particular when you're using dynamic routes with variables like this. If everything is just hard-coded, then there's no ambiguity. Every request can only match one route. But sometimes you get fancy and then things get tricky. All right, do we have any other questions?
I'm not sure what you mean by that. Yeah, I don't get what that meant. I'm sorry.
All right.
So was that since 51 is only taking an integer?
I'm wondering if it was smart about that and actually didn't match this because I didn't pass in integers. I'm going to change these here. Okay. So I went to the URL with params /foo/bar. And now I have written a route with params /foo/bar. So I would expect that this function would run another route handler, which does nothing. So it should throw an error. But instead, it's running this function here. Whoop, this function with params, passing in foo and bar as age and height, which is why we get your foo feet tall and bar years old. So clearly that's not what I meant to happen here. You see what's going on? I'm typing this URL, this exact URL into my browser, where it's running this function it said, because this URL also matches this pattern, and we check them from top to bottom. So the one on line 51 gets checked first, and it matches, so it runs. So if I wanted this to work properly, where my foo/bar route is accessible, or well, where both of them are accessible, I would put this above it so that first it'll check for this hard-coded path. And then if it doesn't get exactly /foo/bar, but some other text in between slashes, it'll try with this second one. Oh yeah, so now it throws an error because this doesn't return anything. All right. So now when I change the order of those routes, it's able to match them correctly. Putting foo/bar on top, and then it correctly tells me this is not a dynamic URL, which is the output I actually get from another route handler, which is handling /foo/bar. So this is working how I expect it to, because I rearranged my route handlers here. So does that help? Are you able to see how the order matters in this case? It's just because these are dynamic routes that can potentially match multiple requests.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. All right, any other questions for today, this lecture? We all questioned out? Alrighty. So thanks for listening. Thanks for asking questions, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope this was informative and not too intimidating. I really do want you all to understand your system and just know what Django and Python are made of. Courtney, question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm still unclear on, like, before we activate the, I guess, the server, like the steps before we activate it, if that makes sense.
Before I start the server?
Yeah, like in the very beginning, what did we need to do in order to, like, before typing in the source and then the folder names and the activate?
So before activating the virtual environment, we created it. I did that with so there's a built-in module venv, which we use. Say python-m venv, and then the file path where you want to create it. So what you saw me doing earlier, like python-m venv /.venvs/ my project name, and then I hit enter, and then it creates a new virtual environment called my project name in this folder /.venvs. Probably the other style is a little simpler. I think Anchor does this sometimes, python-m venv, and then just venv. You make a folder called virtual environment in your current folder. So in some ways, this is simpler because you keep the virtual environment closer to your project. It's in the same folder. And you don't have to get creative about coming up with different names for them. But it also has the disadvantage that they don't have different names when you want that. And also now your virtual environment is in your project, so you have to take care that it doesn't get committed in your Git repository. So you would have to git ignore your virtual environment if you wanted to store it inside the same folder. So yeah, after you, so running python-m venv, this creates the folder structure for your virtual environment, and then you can activate it with source. Was there another question just now?
Yeah, follow on to that. Do you have to close these down at all, or are they automatic at closing?
So all it really does when you activate a virtual environment is it like changes variables in your path. So I think closing your terminal tab is sufficient. Like if you want to use the same terminal tab, you have to run deactivate. But if I just like close this terminal, then my virtual environment is like closed now basically, and there's nothing still running or open that I have to deal with.
Okay, got it. So if you want to run a new virtual environment, you'd have to activate it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because yeah, you can see right now I've got my normal command prompt again. I do not have any virtual environments activated.
Okay, so then what's the benefit of working inside of one for a small project like this?
That the next time I do another small project, that small project can have a separate set of dependencies that are not affected by the dependencies for this project. So maybe they use 2 incompatible versions of Django. I can keep that separate.
Okay, Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other last minute questions?
Will you open up the breakout rooms? I feel like it's gonna be a process just trying to make sure that we get them activated properly, I guess.
Yeah. Breakout rooms would be good for that. I'll be sure to open those up after the lecture. Okay, so do you have a homework assignment for you tonight? This should be not too overwhelming, not too challenging. Like the actual math and logic you're going to be doing should be pretty simple. It's going to be like second grade geometry or whatever. Really, the hard part of this assignment is just making sure you understand all the basics that I went through today of just virtual environments, package management, just how a web server works. I'm really kind of assuming that people are going to get stuck on a lot of the basic things, and we're going to need to work through this kind of slowly. So this exercise is deliberately not super ambitious. I just want to make sure you understand your system works. So maybe take a few minutes extra if you complete the assignment fast to poke around your virtual environment, CD into some folders, try activating and deactivating things and see how it changes other things you're familiar with. Yeah, I had wanted to do some exercise review this afternoon because I did see some really awesome examples of some of the recent homework problems in the memes chat. Really proud of y'all. But unfortunately, it's getting kind of close to lunchtime. So I'm assuming people don't want to spend an extra 20, 25 minutes on exercise review right now. So might do that this afternoon or tomorrow morning, depending on time. But I think right now it's time for lunch. All right, so thanks everybody. Enjoyed it. Have fun. Take care.